This isn't quite the picture that I wanted, but I'm not going to spend too much more time looking for one. I've done a number of Google image searches. I thought I had a picture on my computer that I had saved for this video, but I can't find it. So this could easily have been a picture of Gimli and Legolas. I always want to call Legolas Aragorn for some reason. Gimli and Legolas from Lord of the Rings, but I didn't find a picture of them that I really liked. So we get this. Dwarves and elves. Very standard fantasy races. Tolkien did his thing, and I have no problem with it. Everybody then copied him, and I have a big problem with it. If you ask any role player, especially anybody who's played D&D, dwarf or elf, they should be able to give you an answer pretty quick. It doesn't require a lot of thought. I'm a dwarf. My brother is an elf. I'm a PC. My brother is also a PC. It just, certain things kind of attract you towards them. Now, that's not to say because I like dwarves better that I never play elven characters, because I totally do. And my brother likes elves better, but that doesn't mean he doesn't make dwarven characters, because he totally does. But we identify better with one race or the other. What I was thinking about, and this comes from the same line of thought as the, of I think 2 videos ago, talking about making the world very realistic, using the Magical Medieval Society map building book. I was thinking, rather than kind of rejecting the super realism, and rather than embracing the weird, let's go with the realistic side and see what the logical consequences of dwarves and elves would be. And I don't necessarily mean overall. Let me tell you very specifically what I was thinking about. Long ago, I started liking dwarves. They were one of my favorite races from the very beginning of D&D, even all the way back in the Little Brown books. I liked the idea that dwarves were inherently resistant to magic and beat face and could also be clerics. I was not as super impressed with the elves, but I do always have a little chip on my shoulder in that elves are generally made out to be better than dwarves. This is Tolkien's fault, and it's not Tolkien's fault. Tolkien did what he did, and it was fine, and then everybody copied him, is the problem. So you ended up with the elves and the... I'm not going to be able to remember the names right now, but the angel-y people, and they're all presented as the best in The Lord of the Rings. And even in, like, The Hobbit, when Oakenshield finds an elven blade, and that's awesome and super better than anything made by dwarves. That's fine within the context of The Lord of the Rings, but people in copying it have now made that kind of the standard across everything. So you end up with elves making better armor than dwarves, or elves making better weapons than dwarves, or elves making better jewelry than dwarves, and elves just generally being the masters of everything. And I don't like that, not just because I like dwarves better than elves. I don't like that because it's just, I don't like the elves being all super awesome all the time. In my mind, and to my bias, dwarves and craftsmanship go together. And that's generally, for example, 3rd edition, and even 4th edition, give dwarves bonuses to crafting. Elves don't get bonuses on crafting, so why should the greatest craftsmen be elves and not dwarves? Does that make sense? So looking at this, I know I was talking earlier about hyper-realism and that, and then I'm using skill bonuses in the game to justify it, but it's a whole mixed bag. So in my mind, if you want the most well-made thing, you should be going to a dwarf, because they are the best at making stuff. And for reference, I submit all of Norse mythology, where the dwarves came from in the first place. Gods need something made, they go to the dwarves to get it made. Growing up, I was always very much into Norse mythology. I really liked the Norse mythology, and there were a couple of books at our local library that I checked out all the time. So, for me, dwarves make stuff. and that's awesome. Some of the early adventures I had even read, one of them there was a dwarven trap. I always remember this. I could not tell you which dungeon it was, which module, but I always remember that there was it was a dwarven dungeon, and there's a trap where there's a footfall. Basically, if you step onto this one block in the floor, the block turns. So, and what'll happen is the block turns and your foot gets trapped in between the turning block and, well, I say turns. Turns makes me think like it's horizontal and it kind of spins. But this is a vertical kind of spin. Like if you've ever been at a park, those kids' toys where they have like the tic-tac-toe boards on those triangles and they spin around. This dwarven trap is kind of like one of those triangles. So it looks like the flat side is up on the floor, and you can't tell that it's any different, but when you step on it, it spins around, and your foot gets trapped between the block and the rest of the floor. And the line that I'll never forget is that it said it only turns one way. This is not a free swiveling block. The dwarves designed it to only spin in one direction. So once your leg gets trapped, you can't spin it the other way to free your leg. Your only option is to cut your leg off. And that's the dwarven mindset. This trap is meant to be a trap, and when you get in it, you're in it. That's it. There is no reset button. There is no safety mechanism. You're trapped. And so I've always loved that. And of course, it was a very difficult role to notice the trap because of the superior dwarven craftsmanship. So, partly drawing from that, I thought to myself, dwarves are really good at crafting stuff. That doesn't mean that elves aren't really good at crafting stuff too. And the one part where there's overlap, major overlap between the two, would be jewelry. Why would this be major overlap? Well, on the one hand, you have dwarven craftsmanship. Dwarves mine gold. Dwarves mine gems and jewels. Dwarves make stuff. So you'd think they'd make pretty dang good jewelry. On the other hand, usually jewelry, it comes in two forms. You can have like the bulky jewelry, like a big, thick golden bracelet brimming with jewels. Very gauche piece, as it were. Or you can have what is the style in a lot of places today, the very delicate, thin, wispy, twisty, intricate pieces. And that definitely seems like at first glance, an elvish thing. But I can totally see dwarves making intricate piecework like that as well. But let's go ahead and give that to the elves. Let's say that the elves make the best fancy, schmancy, intricate, thin, flexible jewelry. Okay? Where are they getting gold from? Are they panning it out of the river? Because when I think elves, I don't think mines. I don't think of elves digging down into the side of a mountain to follow a vein of gold ore and then smelting it, etc., etc. No, when I think elves, I think of hippie tree people living in trees. So it doesn't make sense to me that elves would be that great at metalwork, because it doesn't seem like elves would be too much into the mining part. Dwarves, on the other hand, I think, if I think really hard, I can imagine dwarves in a mountain mining a vein of gold ore and smelting it in a giant furnace. I mean, I do have to strain a little bit to figure this out, but the image is, it's sparking. It's like a lighter, and you're twisting it, and you're trying to get it to light up. I'm seeing little flashes of that image in my mind. And that, by the way, if you don't grasp sarcasm, that was immense sarcasm. Okay. So, it makes more sense then, doesn't it, that dwarves would be better at making jewelry than elves, because dwarves would actually have access to the materials needed to make that kind of jewelry when it comes to things like gold and silver and jewels? Yeah, it does. That's not to say that you might not have better I don't want to say artisanship, because that covers also the craftsmanship part of it. But maybe you have a better designer on the elves. Maybe they're more artistic and creative in that sense. And given that they're usually chaotic and dwarves are usually lawful, you can totally expect a dwarf to follow very precise directions. This is how jewelry is made. These are the 15 designs that are approved. You're going to get one of these 15, whereas elves might make something up completely new. I get that, and I'm totally fine with it. So, also thinking along these lines, I really liked to explore the dichotomy, as it were. So when I think dwarves, I think mountain, I think subterranean, I think craftsmanship, I think lawful. And when I think elves, I think forest, and I think natural, rather than mountains, but more like natural material, and I think chaos. And so the next thing that came to mind, and following along with the jewelry and decorations part, is dwarves probably don't have too many dyes that are based on organic materials. They're going to have some. There's these underground plants and roots and things, but you wouldn't expect too much a plant to make a dye that changes its color solely to have its color changed, like you would expect maybe a plant that outside to. Because if you're underground, it's dark and people can't see color in the dark. Human eyes, for example, our color receptors don't work at low light levels. So at night when you're looking out, you generally can't perceive color unless something is illuminated to a certain level. That's why dark vision, for example, in 3rd edition does not allow you to differentiate colors. It's black and white only. So I would think there's not too many plants that produce bright, vivid colors in the underground. Now, of course, there are chemicals that could be used by plants or animals or what have you, and its chemical structure just happens to also be a color, but it doesn't seem like any of its primary purpose would be coloring. And so what I did was I spent a while on Wikipedia, and this is weeks ago, looking at the different types of dyes that historically have been used. The indigo plant, carmine, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, lapis lazuli. And when you deal with something like lapis lazuli, which is a bright blue stone, well, obviously dwarves are going to probably use that. But when you're dealing with something like carmine, which is a red, or indigo, which is a bluish color, things that are going to be abundant in forests, bugs and roots, you're going to expect more towards the elven side. Now, that I don't think indigo would grow subterraneanly, but you could have a similar plant. And so my thought also, following along this same kind of line, is, as I mentioned earlier, dwarves, you think mining and metals. Elves, you don't think so much mining. And so the one reason why I liked this picture is, look at the elves' armor. That's not metal armor. That's leather and other such materials. And that makes sense. Elves should probably have a low utilization of metal, because they don't mine for metal very often. So you would expect elves to be decked out in leather armor or hide armor or like iron bark armor or something along those lines. And you wouldn't expect them to be all decked out with a sword and a metal shield and things like that. You would expect that they would use mostly organic weapons, quarterstaves, clubs. They can use bows and arrows because the arrow tip is the only part that needs to be metal. And it doesn't even need to be metal. You can make arrowheads out of stone or bone or obsidian, which is kind of a stone, or those are all possibilities. So, and if you are making them out of metal, you need a very small amount. So bows still make plenty of sense for elves. Quarterstaves, clubs, lassos, all those things make a lot more sense than having them decked out in elven chainmail made out of metal and wielding swords, where for some reason all elves know how to use swords. So I would get rid of that. I would make my elves more naturey and more organic and more hippie, I suppose. Elves, on the other hand, would love a big suit of plate armor and a big metal weapon. And that's another thing. So I took swords away from elves. Not completely. Elves can still have swords. You know, you have a certain amount of metal. You fashion a very nice sword. It gets passed down from generation to generation in the family. That makes sense. Dwarves, if you're going to fight dwarves, they're always going to have a weapon at hand. And in that, their weapons are usually tools. When you think of dwarf, you think of hammers, you think of axes, you think of picks. These are all tools that they use normally, and they can double as weapons. One thing you don't usually think about with dwarves is swords, although historically in 1st edition and 2nd edition, the short sword was a very dwarven weapon as well. I'm not sure if I've mentioned in these videos before, but I think it was in the 2nd edition complete book of dwarves that they talked about, or it may have even been in 1st edition or even the little brown books. There was one line that talked about how dwarves like to use weapons. I say like to use. Dwarves are more adept at using weapons like hammers, picks, axes, where there's a lot of momentum. Because they're so broad and so squat, they have a very low center of gravity, and they don't get taken off balance swinging, for example, a sledgehammer back and forth. A human, you swing it, and you got to put some effort into stopping it and swinging it back. For a dwarf with their very broad, low center of gravity body, they swing that thing back and forth without too much trouble. Anyway, there was a video, I think it was by Lindy Beige. He's on YouTube. He talks about weapons in medieval times and role-playing and what have you. And he mentioned the difference between someone having an axe and someone having a sword. And that's because an axe is a tool. When you have an axe, you use it to chop down a tree. Or you can use an axe for a bunch of different chores, as it were. But a sword only has one purpose. A sword is meant to kill people. If you're going to use a sword, it's to attempt to kill a person. And that's why having a sword is I don't want to say a threatening action, but carrying a sword is a subtle type of threat. It's like in Japan, only samurai were allowed to wield wakizashi and katana because they're swords and the only purpose they serve is killing people. So you certainly don't want peasants walking around with such a tool, because what use would they have for it? So it totally makes sense for dwarves to still have swords, because doesn't it just seem like the dwarven mindset would be, this is a hammer, it's a tool, it's meant for this, and that's what I'll use it for. But of course, if I'm being attacked and I have it at hand, I can defend myself with it. But if I'm going to kill someone, wouldn't I want to bring a sword, since that's what it's intended for? Now, that's not to say that dwarves maybe favor those tool-like weapons because they're so familiar with them. A dwarven blacksmith uses his hammer day in, day out for decades, so if he's going to have to go into battle and defend his life, he might want his trusty hammer at his side. So I see that side of it as well. So yeah, they like having themselves encased in armor. They like their weapons. They like their craftsmanship. They make sense, of course, in a very law-abiding, hierarchical society. You know your place. You do your job. That's good. Kind of a communist-esque society. Elves, on the other hand, are more chaotic. And so the fact that elves always have a king, or the fact that there's always these rules that get associated with elves, which draws on the Irish, Celtic, Gaelic, Scottish kind of elven mythos, where they're the fae from the other world, and they have these strange rules they have to abide by. That never really got me, because why should an elf have to follow these weird rules when they're all about being chaotic? Personal freedom, making your own choices. So it doesn't make sense that they would have a king and that kind of thing. Well, what kind of authority would the king have if everybody's kind of taking care of their own? It's just a weird concept to me. I don't really grasp elves because I'm a dwarf, and I grasp dwarves rather well. The last thing I want to do is just share a quick story. I was thinking of... I was listening to music a couple days ago, and I had a thought. I couldn't tell you which issue, but there's an issue of either Thor or the Avengers where they're traveling in the Norse world somewhere, and they have to escape across the Bifrost Bridge. And the entire time they're on this adventure, one of the enemies of Thor in the comic book is the Executioner. And the Executioner is with them and is helping them because if, they're all fighting against a common enemy, and if the Executioner wasn't helping them, the Executioner would die and they would die and everything bad would happen. It's the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of deal. And they get to the Bifrost Bridge, and the entire swarm of enemies is coming at them, and they're going to get overrun before they get to safety. And so Thor stands at the front of the bridge and says that he'll hold them off while everybody else escapes across the bridge. And one or two panels later, you see a big crack against the back of Thor's head, and he collapses. And what happened was the Executioner had grabbed a big rifle or an AK-47 or something. He doesn't usually use weapons. The Executioner is not like the Punisher with a bunch of guns. The Executioner usually has a big axe. But in this case, because of the other people that are in the book with him, he has this big rifle. So he smacks Thor on the back of the head, knocks him unconscious, throws his body on a wagon that the rest of the people are pulling, and tells them to get out of there. And then there's this epic spread of the Executioner just like knee deep in dead bodies, shooting people, crushing dudes, and holding the bridge, and basically redeeming himself from villain to hero in this awesome last stand. It's always been one of my goals in a game of D&D to have a character who does that kind of epic last stand, where I don't care if the guy dies. Let my character die. In fact, it would be better if my character dies holding this bridge so that everybody else can escape. That would be perfect. A real dick of a DM would make you roll dice and actually fight it out, which completely misses the point of the heroic action. So a good DM is going to say, yeah, that's badass. This is what happens. But, so based on that, I was having a thought the other day of an adventuring party. They're being chased down by a horde of goblins or something. Actually, it was gnolls when I was thinking of it earlier. They were being chased by gnolls, and they're heading through this mountain pass. And the rest of the party's all walking along. They're not like running with the gnolls literally 10 feet behind them. They've got like a good lead on them, but they're going to be overtaken because the gnolls are much faster. Maybe the party has like someone who's wounded and they can't travel as quick as they'd like to. And so the dwarf, and my dwarf wields a halberd because I like that. So they're all walking and the dwarf is the rear guard. So he's in the back of the party. And at some point after they pass through this mountain pass, they look back and they notice the dwarf isn't standing with them anymore. And in my mind, the guy who's playing the dwarf wrote a note to the DM, passed it over to him while everybody was talking and discussing, what they're going to do when they get back to town, how they're going to set up defenses and warn everybody. And the DM, he gets this note, and when he looks at it, all it says is that the dwarf character, using the butt of his halberd, he stops while the party continues to walk on, draws a line in the dirt, turns around, and takes 3 steps forward. So now you have this dwarf standing facing this oncoming gnoll horde with a line 3 steps behind him. And the bottom of the note just says, "No one crosses the line until I'm dead." And that's just what the dwarf says to himself, waiting for the oncoming horde. So he's going to be the guy who puts the distance between the party and the horde. And that ties into 3rd edition having a prestige class called the Dwarven Defender, who was adept at not moving from where he's standing, which is why that made sense to me. Now, part of what led to this thought was the idea of, in my world in Trocare, there is an unspeakable evil that lives beneath the earth. And the only person, well, I say only person, the only people who know about it are the dwarves, and the only people who are protecting the rest of the world from it are the dwarves. And much like the Crab clan in Legend of the Five Rings, the dwarves maintain the defense and protect the rest of the world from being overrun by this unspeakable evil. And it is a war of attrition that they are losing, because dwarves do not breed fast enough to replenish their numbers, and every day, inch by inch, they're losing this fight. And one of the things that I thought of was perhaps like a dwarven patrol. They're down in the tunnels, and they encounter the enemy, and they have to get back to warn them. And of course, they're trying to do it stealthily. Another thing that a lot of people don't remember, or no longer like to do, is that back in First Edition and Second Edition, all rogues knew how to move silently. And so dwarves, as rogues, were sneaky. And the sneaky dwarf was a thing. In 3rd Edition and 4th Edition, at least with the people that I've played with, and keep in mind I've been all around the country doing this, nobody likes to play the sneaky dwarf anymore. Everybody likes to play... If you're going to play a dwarven rogue, you tend to be very much the tech guy, all about finding and disabling traps and opening locks and things like that. Which, to be fair, is exactly the skills that dwarves used to get bonuses on in 1st and 2nd Edition anyway. So it's totally fitting with the trope. It's just people have forgotten about the sneaky dwarf part. So, I'm thinking, I see these dwarves, they encounter, an enemy, they start heading back, but unfortunately they're spotted. So now, the Dwarven Patrol has to get back in time to warn the mine or the base or the fort or the colony or whoever it is, that the enemy is coming, and where they're coming from, and how many there are. But if they're being chased hot on their heels, someone's going to need to stay back and hold off, delay the inevitable. So what I see is a dwarf, they've got their plate, he's got plate armor on, and in the back are just a couple of raised loops. So there's these, metal loops on the back. Not really loops. I don't see them as circles. Just, half pipes, as it were. So that you can pass a chain through in multiple directions. And so what happens is he's running back through the tunnel, then he turns around and then activates... Now this gets a little bit, steampunky. He activates a button or a pressure pad or a switch on his arm, and the chains, spikes in the back of his armor fly out into the sides of the tunnels, and they're connected to his armor by chains. And so essentially he's got this chain of this spider web of chains behind him, and it's attached to his back. So he's not going anywhere, and nobody's getting around him till he's dead, and are able to pull the chains out of the stone. And so I just see them, every one of these dwarven patrols has one or more of these tunnel blockers, and that's their job. They know that if things go south and the enemy starts swarming, they're the ones that have to get to the choke point, activate the armor, and hold them off for everybody else to be able to get back, warn them, set up defenses. So it's basically a suicide position, but for a dwarf, it's all right, because they know that if they die, they're holding off and delaying the horde. The rest of the dwarves have a better chance of surviving. So they're doing their duty. And I enjoy that. That sounds fun. Also, dwarves in my world are much more technologically savvy than the other races because of their craftsmanship, because of this losing fight. You run out of men, and you're going to have to find ways to make up for that, and technology has always been the way to do that. That's why they're the only race that knows the secret of gunpowder, why they're the only race that has guns, but they don't bring those guns to the surface, because that would just be bad. The dwarves certainly don't need attention from a bunch of surface races clamoring to get a hold of their weapons. So all of the guns, the gunpowder, the explosives, the cannons, they're all in the deepest tunnels. And if they're about to get overrun, they light it and they blow up. That's the way it works. It's kind of depressing in a way, but that's kind of the point. Anyway, this has been a half an hour of talking about how awesome dwarves are and how much less awesome elves are. But mostly the dwarves. Also, what is wrong with this guy's hand? Look at that. Your hand looks all swollen up. You should get that checked out, my friend. Oh well. Until next time. Bye-bye.